Hello, beautiful best friends. How are you going? Welcome back to our super safe, super cozy little space of the internet. You are looking amazing. I am so excited to be hanging out with you again, and I hope you're having an amazing week. If you're new here, then hi, my name is Liz, and I am so glad that you're here. But just so you know, we're not alone today. We are joined by our very talented guest star, Lily, because she's hyper dependent and will not let me lock her out of the room while I record. So sorry if you hear her occasionally in the background, but also not sorry because she gives us amazing emotional support breaks when things get too intense around here. Yeah, you do. I know, you're not the guest star, you're the real star. Sorry, my bad. So today we're talking about a case that's not so much true crime as it is just a really fascinating mystery that went unsolved and captivated so many people for a good couple of years until it was eventually solved just over a year ago with the help of a whole lot of internet armchair detectives all putting in countless hours to crack the case. This case was actually suggested by the beautiful Piper, who has been here in our safe space since way back. And Piper definitely delivered. This case is filled to the brim with a whole lot of unexpected twists and turns, and the ending is also very unpredictable as well. So if you guys are all ready, let's just dive right in. We're going to begin our look into this story in Big Cypress National Preserve in South Florida. Big Cypress lives up to its name. It's a big place, about 720,000 acres squared, and it sits about 45 miles west of Miami. The preserve is very popular with hikers all year round, and there's a ton of wildlife that call Big Cypress home as well. And it was at about 8 p.m. on the 23rd of July 2018 that after a long day of hiking through the preserve, two men named Nicholas Horton and Logan Bueller came to their destination for the night, Noble's Camp. And they were exhausted. That day, Nicholas and Logan had faced both sweltering heat and heavy rain. They had dodged alligators and snakes, and Nicholas said that his feet were just so sore that he didn't know how much further he could walk. He just wanted to sit down. And so when they got to the campsite and saw that there was already this bright yellow two-person tent set up there by the picnic table, he was initially a little bit annoyed because he just wanted to rest and put his feet up for the night. But now he felt like if they stopped there, they would be cramping this other guy's space. So Nicholas and Logan grabbed a seat at the table and they noticed that there were hiking boots sitting outside the tent and also some hiking poles close by. So assuming that the camper was inside and not wanting to accidentally startle them, Logan called out hello a couple of times, but there was no reply. So they both sat there at the table for a while longer, drinking what they had left of their water and snacking on granola bars, both of them just wondering what was up with this other camper. Had this person just wandered off barefoot, or were they maybe inside the tent and just a really heavy sleeper? Eventually, curiosity did get the best of them, and they had a little peek through the mesh panel of the tent. And Nicholas says that instantly he just forgot all about the pain in his feet. He was just filled with adrenaline and grabbed his phone to call 911 because inside that tent, they had found the body of a man sitting in a twisted, upright position with his eyes wide open, staring directly at them. When investigators from the Collier County Sheriff's Department arrived to process the scene, they went through the man's belongings and found clothing as well as hiking and camping gear, and then some personal belongings, including 2 notebooks filled with handwritten computer code and recipes for energy bars, and also about $3,640 in cash in a plastic baggie. What was more interesting was what the man didn't have. He had no mobile phone, no wallet, no driver's license, no credit cards, like not one thing to identify him at all. And while his tent kind of had garbage strewn around inside it, there wasn't one sign at the campsite of a campfire or any indication that the man had been there for very long at all. There were also no signs of foul play, no signs that a struggle had taken place there, and the man didn't have any wounds as far as they could see. It was as though he had arrived on the site, set up his tent, and then just kind of crawled inside it and died. But 2 days later, when the medical examiner carried out his autopsy, they couldn't determine what exactly the man's cause of death had been. That wasn't to say that he was in great health by any means. In fact, he was suffering from pronounced cachexia, otherwise known as wasting syndrome. Basically, this man was about 5'8" tall, but only weighed about 83 pounds. And I read this weight a couple of times in my research and just thought, oh, wow, that sounds pretty low. But it wasn't until I converted it to kilograms, which is what we use here in Australia, that I found out he was about 37 kilos. So this man was severely emaciated, like his muscle had all but wasted away. And I've seen the photos. You can see pretty much every single rib in his chest. And yet he hadn't necessarily died of starvation because his bladder and colon were relatively full. So he had been eating and drinking in the time leading up to his death. He also had energy bars in his tent, and he was found just about 5 miles away from a highway and about 4 miles away from a reserve. And he had all of that cash. So he should have been able to easily access food or help if he had needed it. It was clear from the condition of his body that he couldn't have been dead for more than a couple of days before he was found, because it was so hot and humid at that time of the year that if it had been much longer, his remains would have been in much worse condition. The man was estimated to be between 35 and 50 years old. He had blue-grey eyes, greying, dark brown hair and a beard, and his teeth were in excellent condition, meaning that he couldn't have been roughing it out there in the wilderness for too long. There were no signs of excessive drug or alcohol use. In fact, the only chemicals found in the man's system were ibuprofen and antihistamines, and he didn't really have any distinguishing features. He had no tattoos or distinctive scars other than a faint linear scar on his abdomen, which was presumed to be from a previous surgery of some kind. So the Collier Sheriff's Department, armed with what little information they had, set about identifying their John Doe so that they would be able to inform his family and loved ones that he was deceased. And they started by going through all of the missing persons reports from the area where his body had been found, but none of the reports matched their guide. And when they broadened their search to the surrounding areas, they were met with the same results. They ran his fingerprints through their databases, first the criminal ones, and when that turned up nothing, they checked military databases to see if he had served in the military, but there were no matches. And so after trying in vain to identify the man for about 2 weeks, the investigators turned to the public for help. They had a composite sketch created and released a bulletin asking anyone with information to please come forward. And considering how little luck they had had so far, they were surprised at how quickly the tips started rolling in and how quickly the man's story came to life. Like literally just minutes after they put the composite sketch on their Facebook page, a woman contacted them saying that she knew who the man was. This woman was Kelly Fairbanks, and she's what's known as a trail angel, which is a person that will actively go out of their way to help hikers doing long treks. They'll leave food and water out for them at campsites or at certain spots along the trail. Some of them will even open up their homes for hikers if they need a place to shower or somewhere to stay for the night. Like literal angels. Kelly said that the second she saw that composite picture, she knew who the man was. She had met him in Crestview, Florida in January 2018, so about 6 months before he was found deceased. And she told investigators that she had seen the man hiking along the side of the road and approached him, offering him a bag of drink mixes and asking if he was experiencing any troubles on his hike, just being the trail angel that she was. And she said that the man had given her a big smile and introduced himself by his trail name, Mostly Harmless. A trail name, FYI, is a name that is given to a hiker more often than not by other hikers they encounter on the trail, usually based off their initial impression or conversation, and it's seen as like a badge of honor that kind of makes you part of the club. And so now, thanks to Kelly, the police at least had a name for the man, Mostly Harmless, even though obviously it didn't exactly tell them a whole lot about him. Kelly said that during the 20 minutes that they chatted, Mostly Harmless had joked and laughed with her, and that he had been really friendly and had this really kind aura about him. And she'd been concerned to learn that he wasn't carrying a phone with him, something quite uncommon for hikers, even those wanting to disconnect and go off the grid a little bit, because it still just made sense to use GPS and hiking apps to navigate the trails and avoid getting lost. Also, the hiking community is really close-knit and really communicative amongst themselves, and were usually part of Facebook groups where they could all chat and share their tips and experiences. In fact, Mostly Harmless was the only hiker that Kelly had come across that didn't carry a phone with them. Instead, he was just using a paper map of Florida with the trail roughly marked out in pencil to find his way. He was also carrying around that two-person tent, which Kelly felt was way too big for him to be carrying on such a long hike. You know, he seemed to be making all of these rookie mistakes that made her worried for his safety and well-being. But he told Kelly that he had started in New York and was headed to Key West. So she figured that he had made it this far, he must be okay and know what he was doing. This type of very long distance hiking is often referred to as through hiking, where someone will travel a trail end to end, often crossing through multiple states, and sometimes the entire journey can last multiple years. So this information Kelly had provided to investigators was super helpful, and she had given them their first big breakthrough in the case. And even better, she said that after Mostly Harmless had turned her down for a place to shower or do his laundry, they had parted ways, but not before she had given him a through hiker sticker and had him pose for a photo with it, which is something that she would often do with the hikers she interacted with. And in this photo, I mean, Mostly Harmless looks pretty healthy. He's clearly not in the emaciated condition he would be when his body would be found in 6 months' time. But police were certain this was their guy, and it turned out that as more and more tips came in, this was not the only photo taken of Mostly Harmless by any means. He had been photographed by dozens and dozens of people that had all had encounters with him in the months leading up to his death. The case quickly picked up popularity online, and so people were posting all about it on sites like Facebook and Reddit and web sleuths, and people would be like, hey, I know that guy. I took this picture of him here on this date. And then someone else would say, oh, I saw him too, but it was on this date and he was here, literally hundreds of miles away. But once you put all of these photos and stories together, almost like the pieces of a patchwork quilt, they started to form a general timeline and route that police believe Mostly Harmless had taken on his through hike. So it's believed that Mostly Harmless began his through hike in Harriman State Park in Sloatsburg, New York in April 2017, where he ended up on the Appalachian Trail, headed south, and hiked through Pennsylvania and then carried on into Maryland. And the name that kept continually popping up online and in the tips coming into police was that same trail name that Kelly had given them, Mostly Harmless. And there were a couple of stories about how this name had come about. Some people said that Mostly Harmless had gotten his name when a couple of fellow hikers had invited him to join them around a campfire. And then, because stranger danger, as a joke, they had said, wait, like, you don't bite, right? And he had laughed and said something along the lines of, no, I don't bite. I'm mostly harmless. But there were others that said that his trail name was a reference to the final book in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series by Douglas Adams. And to avoid confusion, we are going to refer to Mostly Harmless as Mostly Harmless for most of this video, at least until later on when we find out his real name. But those that encountered Mostly Harmless early on in his through hike actually knew him by a different trail name, Denim. And Denim was a name that he had earned by wearing jeans during the first 2 weeks of his journey. And apparently this is something that no experienced hiker would dream of doing. Like, there's actually a saying amongst hikers that cotton kills because it gets wet and cold easily and doesn't dry quickly. So because of hypothermia and other health risks, cotton clothing, including denim jeans, is very strongly advised against for long distance hiking. Yeah, you probably are going to feel also like an expert in hiking by the time we're done here today. You are welcome. Oh, hi. Are you an expert hiker as well? Not likely. You die after a half-hour walk. Can you imagine if I tried to take you hiking? You'd probably call the RSPCA on me. Investigators were able to build a better picture of who Mostly Harmless was by piecing together the little snippets of his personal life that he had shared with other hikers and trail angels. For instance, they learned that he had said he had left his life in Brooklyn after working in the IT industry for a decade, telling people that he wanted to detox from the digital life because he had been depressed and needed a complete change. And so he had headed to Harriman State Park, where he camped illegally for a little while before starting the Appalachian Trail because he was scared of getting caught out by authorities. To others, he just said that he wanted a change, and so he was working on a hiking app. He also told people that he was from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, but no one mentioned him having a very strong accent. Mostly Harmless's pace was described as slow and steady. Like, he told people he was only hiking about 10 miles or 16 kilometers a day, which sounds like a whole lot to me, but apparently that's nothing for hikers. But by the summer of 2017, Mostly Harmless had reached Virginia, and it was there that he traveled for about 100 miles with a hiker named Obsidian, which is a big distance and pretty out of the ordinary for two hikers that didn't know each other. But Obsidian said that while they did make a bit of an odd couple, she being a 66-year-old black woman and Mostly Harmless being a white man that she estimated to be around 40 years old, they hiked at the same slower pace due to both of them having issues with their knees. And you do see in some of the photos of Mostly Harmless that he was wearing these knee braces, so it does seem like they were a point of struggle for him. Obsidian said that while a lot of hikers she encountered on the trail gave her weird vibes and made her uncomfortable, she stuck around with Mostly Harmless for so long because he was lovely and made her feel safe. She said that during their time together, she taught him how to make a proper fire, and he snacked on M&Ms while they hiked and told her about how much he wanted to see a bear in the wild. She also noticed that he tended to obsess about distances between destinations, and they had this really good connection, but they ended up splitting ways in Buena Vista, with Obsidian never learning what Mostly Harmless's real name was. She just knew him as Denim. She did say, however, that she had seen him use the name Ben Bilemy when checking into hostels and signing guest books at cabins. And yes, when investigators and internet sleuths learned this, they of course heavily looked into the name Ben Bilemy, but it was a dead end. It turned up nothing in their searches. The name didn't even seem to exist within the US, and there were no missing Ben Bilemies that they could find. And so it seemed like this was just an alias that Mostly Harmless used because he wasn't allowed to check in using his trail name. So after parting ways with Obsidian, Mostly Harmless continued his travel through Virginia and had more interactions with more hikers. And all of these hikers could not speak highly enough of him, describing him as really kind and also really generous. Like, one Reddit user said that when he had mentioned that he was low on water, Mostly Harmless had insisted that he take a liter of his because he had extra. On the 7th of October, Mostly Harmless was photographed while out for dinner with several other hikers at Damascus Pizza Co. Bar and Grill, still in Virginia. During this time, he was staying at Woodchuck's Hostel for 2 days because of an incoming hurricane, and there's this photo of him taken at the hostel that shows this big, huge backpack that he carried throughout his entire hike. This backpack weighed 53 pounds or about 24 kilos. And we know this because another hiker found it so bizarre and funny that he had made Mostly Harmless place it on the scale and he took a photo. Basically, all of the hikers around Mostly Harmless considered this bag to be way too big and heavy for the type of through hiking he was doing. You know, hikers would usually trim their gear right down for that kind of trek. And as well well as this big, heavy bag, Mostly Harmless had his bad knees, so it was no wonder that his pace was on the slower side. By the end of November, though, he had made it to Georgia, and on the 22nd of November, he checked into the Top of Georgia Hostel and Hiking Center, once again under the alias Ben Bilemy. And before he left a few days later, he bought the yellow two-person tent that he would later be found in, deceased. On the 1st of December, Mostly Harmless stopped at a shop just south of our town called Mountain Crossings, and he told the veteran hiker working there that day, Matt Mason, that he wanted to map out a path to Florida Keys, which he had told multiple people was his ultimate destination and where he intended on ending his through hike. And Matt said that he was really more impressed than concerned when he told Mostly Harmless that he could download a map on his phone, and Mostly Harmless turned around and said that he didn't have a phone. And so Matt printed out about 60 pages of this map and sold it to him for about $5, which he noticed that Mostly Harmless paid for out of a wad of cash that looked to be about an inch thick. And then he asked Mostly Harmless if he could take a picture of him, which he then posted on the Mountain Crossings Facebook page. Another hiker who said that they had met Mostly Harmless just a few days after this at a shelter at Springer Mountain in Georgia had a few more clues to shed some light on the unidentified man's past. He said that he and Mostly Harmless had been the only two hikers at the shelter, and they ended up chatting quite late into the evening. And he said that while they had spoken about light topics like Doctor Who and their love for science fiction, the conversation took a pretty deep turn when Mostly Harmless told him that his father had been abusive in his younger years and that he no longer spoke with his parents. He also said that he had a sister, and he spoke about an ex-girlfriend as well. 2 weeks after this, Mostly Harmless was spotted hiking through a snowstorm in Alabama, apparently looking like he was just loving life with this big, huge grin on his face. And then we come back full circle to the 24th of January 2018, when Kelly Fairbanks, the first person that reached out to the Collier Sheriff's Department, spotted Mostly Harmless trekking along the roadside in Crestview, Florida. And Kelly said that when she first saw him walking and she saw that big graying beard, she had assumed he was an older guy. It wasn't until she got closer and saw his eyes that she realized he was much younger. And it sounds like in the short time that they spoke, he made a big impression on her, like he had with a lot of other people on the trail. And she said that she went out of her way to help in the investigation because if it were her baby brother that was in trouble or distanced, she would want someone to do the same for him and give him his name back. On the 22nd of February, about a month after Kelly had spoken with Mostly Harmless, two female hikers named Snapper and Sugar Rush, which you have to admit are just the cutest trail names ever, by the way. But anyway, they were on a flooded trail in the Osceola Wildlife Management Area, about 170 miles east of Crestview, when they came across Mostly Harmless. And they were also thrown by him doing this huge hike with no GPS or phone and just this paper map that he had. And so they went out of their way to go over the trail with him in greater care and with more detail than they usually would, concerned, just like Kelly had been, that he was going to get lost. A couple of days later, another female hiker said that she met Mostly Harmless in the Pine Log State Forest. And when they spoke, he again mentioned his sister, saying that he had been staying with her before he began his through hike, either in Sarasota or in Fort Myers. And he also told her that he had been experiencing some health issues and wanted to complete this hike while he still could. Then on the 15th of April 2018, another trail angel, Mike Gormley, known by his trail name Waterboy, came across Mostly Harmless hiking along the side of the road. And Mike said that it was really hot and muggy that day, and he was surprised when he asked about the enormous backpack. Mostly Harmless said that he was still carrying wearing his winter clothes. And so Mike offered to take them and mail them home for him, but this was an offer that Mostly Harmless declined. Mike said that Mostly Harmless didn't ask him for anything, but very gratefully accepted a couple of bottles of frozen water and Gatorade when he offered them. And this turned out to be the very last confirmed sighting of Mostly Harmless while he was still alive. Mike took a couple of photos of him in which you can see that his beard is a little bit shorter and his face is a little bit tanner, and he's lost a little bit of weight, but he's nowhere near the emaciated condition he would be found in just 99 days later. Instead, Mike estimated his weight to be around 150 pounds or roughly 68 kilos. What was really interesting though is that Mike's encounter with Mostly Harmless took place only about 10 miles north of where his body would be found at Noble's camp over 3 months later. So the question was, in between that time between the 15th of April when Mike had seen him and the 23rd of July when his body was found, did Mostly Harmless possibly complete the trek to Key West, which he told people was his goal? Did he maybe encounter a problem and try and turn back? Or did he reach Noble's camp not long after Mike saw him and then just stay there all of that time by himself? And this was the issue that investigators and internet sleuths found, was that even though they had put all of this legwork into nailing down a timeline and route for Mostly Harmless for the months leading up to his death, there were still big questions left unanswered. What had made him just one day spontaneously up and leave his life and disappear into the woods? How had he died? And of course, who was he? These questions were proving impossible to answer because while it seemed like Mostly Harmless hadn't shied away from the hikers and trail angels he came across or from having his photo taken by anyone, he had made deliberate steps to make sure that it would be impossible for anyone to actually find out who he was. You know, he had told these people conflicting stories about where he was from and his life before the through hike. He had used an alias to check into hostels and cabins, and because he didn't carry a mobile phone or GPS and he had paid for everything in cash, there was literally no digital trail for anyone to follow. Like, it was pretty safe to assume that he didn't want to be found or traced. Also, none of the photos that anyone had taken of him returned any results when run through facial recognition software. So these hundreds and hundreds of people online wanting to solve the mystery had to get creative. Like, for a while, everyone was convinced that the computer code in the notebooks would be what cracked this case. This code was for an online strategy game for programmers called Screeps, and the online community thought that if they could just track down a player that had stopped logging in around the same time that Mostly Harmless had begun his big through hike, then maybe they could use that player's credit card details to find out who he was. But this isn't what led to his identity being revealed, even though later his account was found and his username proved to be a contraction of his real name. People, of course, compared Mostly Harmless's story to the Christopher Mccandless case, who was the subject of the book and 2007 film Into the Wild, in which he was played by Emil Hirsch. Christopher Mccandless had also just up and left his whole life and disappeared into the wilderness in Alaska before dying a couple of years later in 1992, starving and desperate for help. The thing was that even though Christopher had also been found by authorities with no identification, it had only taken them about 2 weeks to figure out who he was when someone who knew him heard about the case being spoken about on the radio and called in. So in the age of the internet and social media, with all of the witness accounts and photos that had come in and all of these people putting in countless hours to identify this person, like, we're talking one of the Facebook groups dedicated to the case had over 7,000 members. So with all of this going on, how was it possible that Mostly Harmless's case had been going unsolved for almost 2 years now? There were, of course, plenty of theories that people came up with because this was the internet. And while some of them seem very logical and totally conceivable, Some were pretty wild. Some people guessed that Mostly Harmless was on the run from the law or from someone that was trying to hurt him. There was a theory that he was a missing child from the 90s that didn't want to be found. And there was also the theory that he had come from a wealthy family but found no satisfaction in the high life. And so he abandoned it, finding more joy and fulfillment in the wilderness. There was one thing that everyone could agree on, though, that this guy had to have a family and loved ones out there that were missing him and wondering where he was, and they were determined to give them closure and bring him home. So when a fundraiser was started to have his DNA tested by Othram, a privately owned company that works directly with law enforcement to solve cold cases and unidentified person cases through forensic genealogy, the target goal of $5,000 was achieved very quickly. The testing began in July 2020, and so did the wait for results, which could have taken anywhere between a few weeks and a few years. But in the end, it took about 6 months for Mostly Harmless's identity to finally be revealed. The testing completed by Othram had determined that he had Cajun roots, and they had also been able to pinpoint his origin to Assumption Parish in Louisiana, where he had family members with the last name Rodriguez. When this information was revealed, people focused their pictures and their posts and targeted Facebook ads directly to that area. And it was just a matter of time before, in December 2020, multiple people who recognized him and his photo contacted the Collier Sheriff's Department, who then contacted relatives in Louisiana that agreed to provide DNA for comparison. And on the 12th of July, 2021, the department released a public statement that Mostly Harmless's identity had finally been confirmed. Oh, hi. Are you trying to draw out the big reveal? Are you trying to draw it out? How mean are you? They're all waiting. Mostly Harmless was Vance John Rodriguez. Vance had been born in February 1976 near Baton Rouge, Louisiana, meaning that he would have been 44 years old when he died. And the big shock for everyone was that despite all of the time and effort they had put in to solve his case and give him his name back, primarily because they believed that he must have loved ones out there wondering where he was, no one had ever reported Vance as missing, even though it was revealed that he had a twin sister, an older brother, and that both of his parents were still alive. Before he disappeared in April 2017, Vance had been living in Brooklyn on his own, running his own startup company called VTech out of his apartment. And it hadn't been until January 2018, when his rent had gone unpaid for 6 months and his landlord finally got a warrant to get into his apartment, that anyone even realized that he was missing. The landlord says that when he got inside, it looked as though Vance had simply stepped out for a moment and would be back any second. There was computers and video game things everywhere. There was food in the cabinets and the fridge, clothes in the wardrobe, and of course, there was Vance's wallet with all of his ID and credit cards inside. It really was as though one day he had just stood up and left on a whim, never once looking back at the life he had left behind. Once the news broke that Mostly Harmless had been identified, several of his family members joined that Facebook group that I mentioned earlier with 7,000 members, but none of them ever commented or liked any of the posts on the page. And so this left a lot of confused people, because even though they had finally solved this big mystery of who Mostly Harmless was, now they were faced with a whole new mystery. How was it possible that this man who seemed as sweet and gentle and kind as Vance, who had made such a lasting impression on so many people during his 1,400-mile journey, had come from this family that seemed to not care at all that he had gone missing and died? There were a lot of hurt feelings. You know, these people were angry and hurt that Vance's family could seem so cold and heartless, and his family copped a lot of heat on these pages. And then over the next few weeks and months, people from Vance's past started coming forward to share their experiences with him. And these experiences painted a much darker and troubled picture of the hiker known as Mostly Harmless and his his life before he disappeared. A former roommate of Vance's named Randall came forward and said that there was a reason that no one had reported Vance as missing. Randall said that he had met Vance in 1994 when they were both attending the University of Louisiana, and the two of them had spent a lot of time together because they were both really into computers and video games, and they didn't have a whole lot of other friends. It's worth noting here that this same year, Vance was arrested for shoplifting, and it's unclear whether he was fingerprinted or not, and if he was, why his fingerprints were never able to be matched to those prints and reveal his identity to authorities. After college, Randall and Vance became on and off roommates in Baton Rouge for about 5 years, and Vance would more often than not go to Randall's family's house for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and Randall said that Vance never really wanted to speak to him about his family, but other people said that Vance had told them that his father had hurt him deeply in his childhood, but refused to elaborate beyond that. When it came to the scar on his abdomen, though, this was something that Vance was very open about with his friends. He said that one day when he was 15 years old, he had made an attempt to end his own life, where he took a shotgun and walked into the middle of a field and shot himself in the stomach. But as he was laying there on the ground bleeding, he changed his mind and decided that he wanted to live. And so he raised his arms and waved them around as best he could. And by some miracle, a truck driver that was driving past on the highway saw him and pulled over to help him. Vance was then rushed to the hospital, where he was taken straight into surgery. And that's where he got the scar. And from this point on, after receiving a life-saving blood transfusion at the hospital, Vance told people that he would regularly donate blood because he knew it would mean the difference between life or death for someone else. When he was 17, Vance went on to be emancipated from his parents with their consent, and he said that this was something that he had wanted because he was so angry at them that they had had him institutionalized after his suicide attempt. Vance never graduated from college, but Randall said that he was very smart and didn't have any trouble finding work. In 2012, he started working for a company called Shopper's Choice in Baton Rouge, where he worked his way up from a job in programming to be the company's senior architect and developer. And his former colleagues said that while working there, Vance had thrived on challenges and was, quote, wicked smart. Like, there was one particular quote I came across from a woman that had worked with him that actually made me laugh. She said he was a crazy good coder, except he would always code everything in the hardest way possible. Kind of like you hired Rembrandt to paint your bathroom. You know it's going to be lit, but over the top. Vance's colleagues from Shopper's Choice described him as quiet, but not like over the top reclusive. Like, he preferred to work on his own with his headphones in, but with a bit of convincing, he would also attend the company's holiday parties and at least try to look like he was having a semi-decent time. Reading through all of the different accounts of what people had to say about Vance before he disappeared, though, it seems like there were two different versions of him. Like, there was the gentle, kind, charming version of Vance that people said had helped them study and graduate, that had chopped off his waist-length hair and donated it to Locks of Love. And this was the version that people who had only known him as Mostly Harmless or Denim had encountered on the trail. The version that, I mean, there's no real denying, had been romanticized and almost idolized by thousands of people on the internet. But then there was this other version of Vance that only those who were close to him and cared about him would see. And this was a side of him that was wrestling with demons and quite clearly struggling with some serious mental health issues that he refused to seek help for. Randall said that during the time that they were roommates, there would be times where Vance would go into these deep stages of depression where he would essentially shut the world out and everyone in it and just sit in front of his computer screen, sometimes playing video games for up to 18 hours a day, or just sleep for days on end. Other people had similar experiences with Vance that they would call call outages. And it would hurt because Vance would go from that nice and kind and caring version of himself to just shutting down and shutting them out at the drop of a hat. And he would lay in his bed, refusing food and all human contact, and would sometimes not speak to them for days, weeks, even years at a time. Probably the most troubling accounts about Vance's past, though, came from two of his ex-girlfriends. One of these women said that she and Vance had dated for nearly 5 years in Baton Rouge before splitting up in 2010. And after the breakup, when everything was over, she posted a status update to Facebook reading, "Apartment, $950 a month, bills, $300 a month, standing up to the monster that beat you up emotionally and physically for 5 years? Priceless." Her mother also took to Facebook after the identity reveal to say that this man was so abusive to my daughter. He changed her. Another of Vance's former girlfriends that has come forward has said that he moved from Baton Rouge to join her in New York in 2013 after they had met in an online chat room and traveled back and forth a couple of times to see each other. And she said that when they first moved in together, he was romantic and sweet, but before long, something set him off and he had one of his outages and shut her out. And he did, of course, come out of it, but from there, it all became very turbulent. She said that at one point, Vance told her about the abusive way he had treated some of his partners in the past. And she says it feels like it should have been a big red flag for her, but she stayed because she could tell that this was something that he was harboring a lot of guilt for and something that he wanted to get off his chest and confess and change about himself. Then in September 2016, this woman was injured in a terrorist attack in Manhattan where a bomb went off and she developed PTSD. But rather than helping her through the trauma, Vance kept a dated log of all of the times that she had needed his help and also locked her outside of the apartment multiple times, once when she had just stepped out of the shower and had no clothes on, even though he knew that her PTSD would be triggered and she would panic if she was outside in the dark alone. As the relationship continued to get more and more toxic, this ex says that Vance threatened to dox her if she ever left him. For those of you that are unaware, the term dox means to publicly publish private or identifying information about a person on the internet, usually as a form of punishment or revenge, which I think we can all agree is a terrifying threat from someone that worked in the tech industry and was as talented in computer science as Vance was. This woman did eventually leave Vance, though, not much later, and this all happened not long at all before Vance disappeared, leading his landlord to believe that this breakup was the reason he had left. And the landlord said that he kept Vance's belongings for 5 months, even though he was only legally obligated to keep them for 30 days. But when he reached out to Vance's ex-girlfriend, she said that she didn't want his stuff. And with none of Vance's family looking for him, the landlord was eventually left with no choice but to leave Vance's belongings in garbage bags on the curb. One thing that's interesting is, despite there being these two different sides to Vance that people from his past would encounter, one thing that they all agreed on was how surprised they were that he had found solace in the great outdoors on the trail. Like, none of them were that thrown by the fact that he had just abruptly up and walked down on his life, but the fact that he had wandered into the wilderness did shock them. Like Randall said that in the time that he had known Vance, Vance's version of being outside was the time it took him to get from the car to the front door. And Vance's ex-girlfriend from New York said that they only went out about once a month, if that. And when she suggested that they book a trip and go traveling together, Vance was like, why would I want to travel anywhere when I can just go online and look at pictures of the places? And yet somehow on the trail, Vance just came alive. Like, you can see it in the photos people took of him. Was it just good old vitamin D from being out in the sun and endorphins from the exercise? Or was Vance elated from the relief of shedding his old self and his old life? One hiker said that Vance had told him that he had experienced joy and like a zest for life on the trail that he had never experienced in his old life. And so really there was hurt on both sides. The online community that had worked so hard to solve the case was hurt that Vance wasn't exactly the perfect swell guy that they had thought he was. And there was just as much hurt on the side of those who knew Vance before he disappeared, even if they had never reported him as missing. I can only imagine how much it must have stung those in Vance's past, hearing all of these reports about how lovely he had been to complete strangers, and that they had wondered why they, the people closest to him who cared dearly for him, had never gotten that side of him. If I'm 100% honest though, I can kind of get it, like not excusing his behavior by any means, but with strangers, you don't owe them anything. They don't owe you anything. And so it's easy to be friendly and kind. Whereas in relationships with friends and family members and romantic partners, there's history, there's obligations to be there for them when they need you, to share things with them, to talk with them. And for someone like Vance, who was very clearly introverted and potentially struggling with very real depression, if he didn't feel like he had that much to give, like his tank was running on empty, but the people close to him were still wanting more, it's possible that he started to resent them. And that's when the darker side of him would come out. The question that is still left unanswered to this day is what exactly the circumstances were that caused Vance's death. I mean, obviously we know that he was severely underweight to the point where he was literally wasting away, but he wasn't exactly starving himself, or at least he had eaten semi-regularly before he died, and he had more food on hand. The general consensus is that most people feel Vance's death wasn't intentional, as in he didn't wander into the wilderness to die. So what happened? Early on, I saw it suggested that Vance had an eating disorder. And although I kind of brushed this idea off at first, now I really do feel like there is something to this theory, because although there's this big disconnect between Vance before he disappeared and Vance after he disappeared, almost like it's two different people, his odd eating habits are something that remained consistent throughout his life. People who knew Vance before he disappeared would say that he would usually eat just one meal a day, and it would usually be something like a frozen lasagna or pizza from Walmart or something. And then during his outages, he would go days where he would straight up refuse food altogether. Then you've got the hikers that went out for dinner with Vance, or Denim as they knew him, who said that he only ate the crust of his pizza. And yes, there is a chance that he was vegetarian or vegan and didn't want to eat the cheese or toppings, but no one from his past mentioned that he had any dietary restrictions. And then there was Obsidian saying that Vance would snack on M&Ms while they hiked. Vance did tell one fellow hiker that he had been overweight in the past. And also when it came to all of the recipes for energy bars in the notebooks that I mentioned at the beginning, not only had Vance written out all of the nutritional information and macros for every recipe, but the bars were said to be way too low in calories for someone that was trying to do a through hike. So is it possible that Vance, while not intending to end his life, was dealing with guilt and trauma from his past by punishing himself and restricting his calorie intake, by carrying a big heavy backpack even though he had bad knees, by being reckless with his safety by not using a phone or GPS to make sure that he didn't get lost and succumb to the elements, and that all of this had contributed to his demise. But speaking of his bad knees, was it possible that Vance's knees had given out on him and he had become literally trapped inside of that tent, unable to go and find help on the highway or at the reserve? And if he was trapped inside that tent with limited food, was it possible that he had been too stringent with his rationing and that it had caught up with him before he realized? Or what if he had had one of his outages and that's why he didn't go and try and find help? It's also been suggested that as an unseasoned hiker, Vance could have easily fallen victim to a trail illness like giardiasis, which is an infection of the small intestine commonly caused by poor water sanitation that, if left untreated, will usually clear up on its own, but it can also lead to weight loss and, in extreme cases, death. One of the leading theories to this day, though, was that the whole reason Vance had left his life behind and wandered into the woods in the first place was that he had been very ill, as in he had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, maybe given a certain amount of time to live, and he decided that he didn't want to spend that time holed up in his apartment in front of his computer alone. Because even though there's no denying that Vance was voluntarily quite reclusive, I think it's also safe to assume that he was lonely. His ex-girlfriend said that she felt like him moving from Louisiana to New York City, a city in constant movement, bustling with people, just made him more lonely because he had no one to connect with. Also, on one of the forums that centered around the programming game Screeps, he had jokingly commented on a post from someone asking for home remedies for strep throat, saying that if he lost his voice, no one would even notice. This theory that Vance was terminally ill was especially fueled by that comment he had made that he wanted to do the hike while he still could. And it's definitely a romantic theory, and you can certainly understand why it's so popular. But the issue here is that there is no mention of a terminal illness or any cancers or tumors in Vance's autopsy report. There was also no prescription medicine in his system or amongst his belongings. So one of the detectives from Collier Sheriff's Department said, "I don't believe that there is anything from a medical standpoint that could have caused him to weigh what he did. He did not have any terminal diseases or wasting diseases that we are aware of that would have been responsible for that." It's another one of the curveballs in this case that isn't easily explained. It was interesting that he was looking at nutritional values and things like that when his body was in the condition it was in. So while it does seem like the most likely explanation for Vance's death was lack of nutrition, what we don't know, and most likely never will, was whether that lack of nutrition was intentional or unintentional. And that's the thing about this mystery. Even though we now know who the hiker known as Mostly Harmless was, if anything, we are left with more questions than answers. And so as usual, I would love to hear what you guys think of this case. Do you have any other theories about what happened to Vance or why he left his life in the first place? This hangout absolutely does not have to end here. We can all just meet up in the comments below and talk it all out. Thank you again so much to Piper for this suggestion. If you guys see her in the comments below, make sure you give her some love because she is a treasure. Oh, hi. Have you come to say bye to everyone? Has all this talk about hiking made you tired? Thank you so much for hanging out with me and Lily today. It means the absolute world to us. We love you so much, and we hope you have a fantastic week, and we will be counting down the hours until we see you in the next one. Bye.